Hello, and welcome to the Pro Series Conversations from CheckBox Pro. My name is Missy, and I'm the founder of CheckBox Pro, where we help school leaders become their most efficient and effective selves by matching them with ed-focused executive assistants. Each member of our team has over 10 years of experience in the education sphere, and though we may consider ourselves pros in some areas, we can't be an expert in every area. This is why we are excited to bring folks working in the education space to offer tools, tips, and insights to make the life of a school leader even more sustainable. Dr. Henrietta Muñoz is the CEO of the Texas A&M University San Antonio Institute for School and Community Partnerships, where she oversees Senate Bill 1882 school partnerships in Edgewood ISD and Cradle to Career Pathways in South Bexar County. With over 25 years of nonprofit experience and 17 years in school community partnerships, she is dedicated to supporting students through innovative practices, research, and equitable policy. Previously, Dr. Muñoz served as Senior VP for Research and Evaluation at United Way of San Antonio and Bexar County, leading data-driven initiatives and major grant-funded projects, including the East Side Promise Neighborhood and Dual Generation Initiative. She has also managed significant community investments with the Annie E. Casey Foundation and the City of San Antonio. A proud Anne E. Casey Foundation Children and Families Fellow, Dr. Muñoz serves on multiple nonprofit boards and has received numerous accolades, including the Texas A&M Chancellor's Academy of Teacher Educators Team Award. She earned her PhD from UT San Antonio and remains deeply committed to education and community justice, inspired by her mother's resilience and aspirations. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much for that warm introduction.
I wish I could tell our listeners, like, your bio is long.
I know. I'm so sorry.
No, that just means you do really great and a really important work. And so it just has to keep growing with all of your accomplishments. But because of that, I had to kind of shrink it down, and I did more of like a LinkedIn bio for our listeners. But, I would love to give, like I said, I had to cut so much away, but I'm afraid I might have cut some really important and key pieces. So before we jump fully into like our questions and why I brought you on, I would just love to have you tell us a little bit more about your background and first and foremost, why data is so important to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you again for having me on your podcast. I'm very excited to be part of this important conversation. As you mentioned, I'm Henrietta Muñoz, and I do serve as the CEO of the Institute for School and Community Partnerships, tethered to A&M San Antonio and the A&M University system. But my background is, my daughter sometimes says, well, you're not a scientist. And I said, yeah, I am. I'm a data scientist. So I call myself a researcher and a data scientist. And I'm also, all of my career have been in the nonprofit space. So I think you touched on all the big moments in my life, in my career of over 25 years, mostly here in San Antonio, but I started my nonprofit career also just outside of Austin in the Lockhart area. And so I have also always been in education. So educational data has always been critical to me. My mom, as you mentioned earlier, she was also in my bio. She's heavily influenced my life, and in particular injustices in our society. And so I remember her, one quick story, I remember her telling me about the drainage problems that we had in our neighborhood. And I grew up in New Braunfels, Texas, so just north of San Antonio, between here and Austin. And the drainage was terrible. We always had, a little bit of rain and it flooded everything. And I remember her telling me, this is going to be your job. You're going to fix it. And, go find out why we don't have drainage in this side of town, and figure it out and then fix it. And much of that were disparities that arose between a segregation of a city. And so this is why I believe I came into the role that I'm in today, she's always said that education was the greatest equalizer, and it is for some people, not for every person. It is for some people, but understanding those disparities through data, I think, is generally what focuses my work today and has been for the past 25 years. So thank you, Missy, for having me again on your show, and I'm excited to jump into the conversation.
Yeah. Okay, well, first question, did you fix the drainage problem in New Braunfels? It's still an
No,
issue.
it's still an issue. You're the first person. I tell that story quite often, and you're the first person who's asked me if I've done that. And I'm kind of glad nobody has said, like, is it done? Is it fixed? Right. But it is not fixed. So we do have friends now in spaces of authority and power in New Braunfels that we're hopeful that we can get this drainage problem fixed, because my parents have now passed. I lost my last parent this last year. And so the house that I grew up in and that has these drainage problems is mine now. And so I need drainage to be fixed in New Braunfels. And I'm gonna gather some data for city council and maybe present some of that to them so they could perhaps spread the wealth, right? Always the opportunity to understand what the data is, I think, is important, and how it impacts communities is really important. So not fixed yet. How about I say yet, not yet.
Yet. That's perfect. That's perfect. I love that. That's such a great segue too, because I think then ultimately, why I brought you on today is because you have sat on quite a few boards, right? And board members help influence, whether it's organizations or cities or town, whatever. And I, over time, have now sat in on quite a few board meetings since starting CheckBox Pro, and obviously mainly school boards. And I just find these rooms really fascinating because they're filled with so many people from different backgrounds and expertise, right? You have the lawyer, you have the doctor, you have the retiree, you have the financial advisor, you have the tech person. So you have all these brilliant humans in a space. And you also have mission aligned folks, which is just a really great combination. But so many of these board members do not come from an ed background. And so I've watched a lot of these people grapple, right, with trying to understand the academic data in a way that allows them to help make informed decisions, right? Which is to your point, right? Like, you're collecting data to hopefully give to city council members so that they can make some informed decisions and see there is a problem here and we need to be part of the solution. So that's all, a reason so many of these board members come and sit on these charter school boards. So with your extensive, professional experience in data collection and analysis, along with your service on multiple boards, I really, truly am excited for this, because I think you're going to be the perfect person that's going to help us understand the issue and how we can help boards and board members that don't come from the same background become more data-informed partners for the schools in which they help govern. So, first things first. Why do you think it is so important for board members to have access to and understand school data in the roles that they play?
Well, it's the responsibility of the school board, right, to ensure that a school campus, if they're a board of one campus or a board of 90 campuses, right, they are the governing body as well as the authorizer or the authority over the health of the institution. And so when you sit on a board, whether it's a school board, a charter school board, a private school board, or even a nonprofit board, right? You have the responsibility. You're bringing your skills and talents and lived experience into the role, and your responsibility is to ensure that the organization, again, no matter what type of organization it is healthy. And part of being healthy is reviewing data around finances, reviewing data around the performance of the organization, and reviewing data on long-term sustainability or strategy, right? So those are, there are probably five more pieces or components of the responsibilities of board members and how it relates to data. But those are some of the big ones, right? the health of an organization, the financial health of an organization is critical, because you either pay employees or don't pay employees. You either have enough money to have teachers on the campus or you don't, right? And so revenue and expenditure data, people I think sometimes think of that as just the finances, and they don't understand sometimes that that's data as well. But also, I think the most traditional or stereotypical data source is, of course, performance data. How well is the organization performing? Relevant to its goals or its targets, right? So if we're talking about school data, we are really talking about ensuring that the schools are performing high quality and offering a rigorous curriculum or rigorous design model for students, and that we are matching, are achieving what those goals are, those targets are. And I think that that's traditionally what school boards and nonprofits and other types of boards really think about, is the performance. When we think about data, we think about performance sometimes. And then that third one about long-term strategy, I think it's important to understand landscape analysis or predictive analytics that allow for us to think about what the future might hold. And that's difficult today, right? Because of AI or, a changing a government, right? That is, there's a lot of movement in our government today with new administration. I think it's difficult to sort of plan out. Sometimes it's difficult to sort of plan out what the future might hold, but agility and understanding that there'll need to be that agility and flexibility, I think is important. And there are data points to those components to think about long-term sustainability. So yeah, I could use all the words here, Missy. So I'll just pause there. I'm not even sure what your question was, other than it is important, I think, for boards of any kind, but certainly school boards, right? Which is primarily the folks that you talk to, understand that their responsibility is to also look at data in various forms, not just around performance.
Yeah. And when you're thinking, because I think yeah, it's important for them to have that data. What do you think is the role of the board? And I know that it's kind of outside of like, why is it important for board members to have, well, maybe it's not really outside. It's tied to, it's like, what is the role of a board member, or specifically a school board member?
Yeah, yeah. Texas Education Agency here in Texas offers a set of minimal requirements or standards for school boards across the state of Texas, especially for those who are public school boards. And some of those standards are placed into a framework called Lone Star Governance. And Lone Star Governance offers, again, I would say it's probably the bare minimum, right? The low end of the standard. We're really trying to get more at a universalism as opposed to a customized way to do your school boards. Not everybody ascribes to Lone Star Governance, and it's not enforced in a way where you are required, because you're a public school board, you are then required to do Lone Star Governance. That's not the case here in Texas, but it is encouraged. And I happen to be trained in Lone Star Governance, and we're practicing those. And so the responsibility of the school board is to hire and fire the superintendent. In my case, I'm labeled a CEO as opposed to a superintendent, but I sit on a founding school board member of a charter school, Essence Prep, here in San Antonio. And our responsibility is to hire and fire the superintendent, and then also to ensure the health of the institution, right, of the organization. And that goes to financial health. We are obligated and responsible for that financial well-being of the institution. And then we are also responsible, although the responsibility really lies through the implementation of the superintendent and his or her staff. We are still to hold accountable the superintendent, the performance for those, for the set of campuses or for the institution. So those are our big main responsibilities as school board members. Traditional public schools across the state of Texas, they because they've been as school boards forever, for 100 years or 50 years or what have you, they didn't have Lone Star governance that long ago. And so sometimes they behave in a way that is different than what I just explained as those top three performances of our behaviors, if you will, of a school board member. So sometimes school boards try to do more than what those three are. Sometimes school boards are a little hands off, right? So there are a wide variety of instances or examples, if you will, across the state of Texas with school boards. But like I said, Texas Education Agency, TEA, does release and encourage a set of standards called Lone Star Governance that really highlight the three that I just mentioned.
Nice, nice. Okay, so if the role of board members, right, is yes, hire and fire. Tell me, okay, so let's do
Hire,
this.
hire,
Hire
fire.
and
Yeah.
fire, and then
This They hold accountable the superintendent for performance,
mhm.
and then the responsibility of the school board is the financial health, right, to well-being, financial well-being of the organization.
Perfect. And you talked a little bit about in that first part of my question about, the sorts of data that school board members should be looking at. And, you mentioned finance and of course performance, which I think is really like that key piece that's missing for a lot of board members, because to look at a student's like academic performance, and taking into account, growth and performance at the
Mhm.
same time, recognizing, right, that you have some students who come in and they come into their schools already behind grade level for whatever reason, right? And it's like, okay, how are we going to look at that data? Like our performance isn't quote unquote on par with our,
Right.
our other schools in our district or with the neighborhood school or whatever that might look like. But, there's so many facets. And so it can be a little bit, I would imagine, disheartening, right? And a little bit confusing to
Mhm.
some of these board members who are going, but our performance isn't looking good, right? And it's like, I don't know
Yes.
how to interpret that data and understanding. So,
Yes.
so in light of that, and then of course still the finance piece, maybe just give us some highlights of like what are the data points, or what are the pieces of data that school board members should be looking at on a consistent basis? First and foremost, let's start that, what data, and then we can kind
Yeah.
of talk a little bit more about how we kind of translate some of that data for newbies.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. The decoding process, right,
Yes.
of data is tedious sometimes. So, I mean, school boards, as well as the superintendent, right, the leader of the organization needs to be looking at this data pretty consistently, as well as the school board, and that is enrollment data, average daily attendance data. Those are really important things, really all year round. So it's not a one point in time, right? But those are really important things all year round. You also want to look at not you want to look at transition data, so data from fifth graders transitioning into sixth grade, eighth graders transitioning into freshman year or ninth grade, and then of course your high school graduation rates. Those are really pivotal years to ensure that students are progressing along, are persisting, if you will, along their natural educational career or pipeline, right, of a career. And so those transition, you want the same amount of students who are entering into kindergarten or first grade are exiting from fifth grade. You want the same amount of students exiting from fifth grade into sixth grade, and then so on and so on. So that those transitions, those matriculations show persistence in the data, persistence in the well-being of the organization, right? As if you have a child and you're going to enroll that child in the beautiful school that this is a school, by the way, one of our murals that we work with.
That's
But if
awesome.
you, yeah, if you were to enroll your kindergartner at this school, one of the data points that isn't always highlighted is if that child can stay till fifth grade, then that means, mom and dad, our guardian, our grandparent, whoever's taking care of the kiddo, as well as the kiddo, has enjoyed their stay, right? And they don't want to move schools. Now there are other factors, mom and dad or guardian can have a job somewhere else and now need to move. But generally speaking, what you want to see is persistence from kindergarten through fifth grade, and that fifth grader is now moving into the sixth grade. So that's data. I don't think that a lot of school boards are even superintendents, because superintendents are held so much to the accountability part, performance part, like state standardized testing, that sometimes we forget that the health of an organization is also making sure that their joy and persistence of that student moving from one grade level to the next, right? So
Yeah.
there are percentages of loss of students due to, like, parents having a different job in a different city and need to move, immigration, or other types of factors that impact that data point. But nonetheless, you still want to look at that data. That, I think, is really critical data for school boards. And then, of course, the biggie, which is, when we say data and people's eyes start to glaze over or roll back in their head, it is that state standardized
Yeah.
data. And that's really important, mostly because that's also how um, uh, how we recruit to schools. If we have A-rated schools or B-rated schools or schools that have great testing scores, families choose those schools for their children. And so it is important for school boards to keep a pulse of what the state standardized testing data looks like for their schools. Some of the things that I think are less noticeable, or notable rather, in a school board is formative assessments. Are assessments done more frequently to determine growth over time? And state standardized testing in the state of Texas, of course, that's STAR. And STAR does have a growth measure, and that's an important, to your point earlier, Missy, when we started this particular this discussion on this question, to your point, you, at least post-COVID, we're in the post-COVID times, and we never get a student who is way ahead, right? That's
Yeah.
that's not the not to say that there aren't students like that, but a lot of students, because of COVID, are at least a half a grade to a whole grade below where they should be, because we lost that year of COVID. And so when we receive a student either in kindergarten or in the fifth grade or even a junior in high school, oftentimes you are going to see some discrepancies in their performance because of COVID. So they're going to start off a little bit behind. And so that growth measure is an important one for school boards to take a look at, because that at least shows, because state standardized testing are going to give us the ratings, right? Is it an A school? Is it a B school? They're going to give us the ratings, but you can't really tell how much you've grown without that growth measure. So the growth measure is really important in the state standardized testing portfolio of data. And then again, some of the data points that are really as notable are the formative assessments that give that growth measure throughout the entire school year, as opposed to that point in time testing called STAR.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that is a key piece to your point, because it then allows board members to see and also
Mm-hmm.
learn a little bit as they're
Mm-hmm.
going. So in light of that and thinking, because I think formative assessments, and then even just to your point, right, enrollment, you mentioned tracking year, or across the entire year.
Mm-hmm.
And this is sort of a personal question, because I don't think that there's probably a one size fits all approach to how data is presented to boards. And again, it goes back to who's on your board, right? Like how, you might need to do more pictures if they're newer board members,
Mm-hmm.
and more graphs and spend a little bit more time there. Or maybe you have folks that have been with you for a long time and you're able to kind of just, here are the numbers and move on, right? But
Yeah.
for you, in your mind, what is an ideal way to present data to boards? And maybe
Yeah.
also tied to that frequency, like how often should they be looking at this data? Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah, you're asking the wrong person about frequency, because I'd say my nonprofit board meets monthly, and I am pretty consistently, at least I hope they feel this way. I feel pretty consistent about showing data every month. And data is can be qualitative, could be quantitative, could be financial data, right? So again, sometimes when we use the word data, we think about performance data. We think about those tests that our students are receiving and being conducted on, and then the results of those tests. So oftentimes, when we use the word data, that's kind of couched into this perception that data is that. data can be all kinds of things. It could be also, like I said, financial data. It could also be qualitative data, like climate surveys as well. How is the culture of the school performing for families? How are families persisting? As I use that word persisting, because what we want to know is, do families feel welcomed in their school? Do teachers feel good about what they're doing in their classrooms? Do they feel like they have the authority that they need or the support that they need to perform, right? So all of that comes in different varieties of data. And so what we try to do, and what I know is, having sat on a data intermediary board. I'm actually the board chair of Community Information Now, which is a data intermediary for our region, not just for San Antonio or the Bexar County area, but for also our region. And also sitting on the charter school board, we see data in all kinds of forms nearly every month, right? And so I do think probably some of the best data has come from the charter school that I've seen. And then, of course, the data intermediary. Well, I mean, they're the experts, right? So and we see pie charts, we see bar charts, we see tables with numbers. Some of the best data that I've seen around fiscal is with our charter school. They have they've outsourced their back office, and so that what we receive are those bar charts, those pie charts that talk about the diversification of revenue, right? And how close we are to spending down the annual budget and where we should be. So in relevance to the target, right? So we want to see, we should be 50% of the way through the budget, spending down the budget 50% of the way through the school year, right? So those are things that I think are important to always share, is a diversification of what's actually shown to you. So you want to see it pictorially, you want to see it in graphs, you want to see qualitative data, sometimes in photos, or even in stories, right? So I would say you really want to diversify what you provide to your board members. It's, again, data is not always student data, right? It's sometimes also what's happening at a family level, or what's happening at the administrative or teacher level. One last point here is school districts across the state of Texas are really into growing their own. And so data points around how a paraprofessional in a school system goes from being a paraprofessional to a teacher, right? Or to a counselor. I've seen a paraprofessional go from being the front office paraprofessional to an actual principal. And so showing that trajectory, right, in a pictorial way. This is kind of an old school way of doing it, but like in an infographic, right? Or, this person was answering the phones and handling families as they walk through the door as a paraprofessional, and now they're a principal. It's actually a pretty amazing story that a district could be super proud of, and then share, publicly on social media or different ways. So, yeah, diversification is really important. It shouldn't all just be tables. You're gonna give somebody a stroke, right? If it's all in one genre of depiction of data.
Yeah. It's almost as if, school leaders should do for their boards like what we ask teachers to do for their students,
Yes.
right? It's like there is
Yes.
not one type of learner, and so there's not one type of consumer of data sitting at that table. It's like,
That's
oh,
right.
no. I'm an auditory person, right? Like I need to be able to hear it, or yeah, I'm a
Yes.
visual person, or gosh, yeah, if you give me one more table where just it starts to all bleed into one thing, that
Yes.
doesn't mean anything to me, right? It's hard
Yeah.
for me to be able to decipher what's standing out versus not. So those are
Yes.
really good. And what a really cool way. And again, just how your brain thinks, and is probably how board members and school leaders should be thinking, is y'all are doing amazing work. Good work is happening in your schools. And to know that somebody has gone from a front office paraprofessional to the
Yeah.
principal is a story that deserves to be told, and is just another way in which it's going to feed back into your staff culture. It's going to feed back
Right.
into your enrollment. It's like, oh, wow, like they invest in their people, right? So
Right.
if they're investing in their staff, they're going to invest in my kid. And so I want my kid to
Right.
be part of that. And so it's just a really good
Absolutely.
narrative in which you're And if you don't have the data, it's really hard to
Yeah,
say that with
no,
confidence. So
that's exactly right. That's exactly right. We're in Texas, and Texas has huge investments in the state standardized test. And so, your show is maybe not a political one, so I'll stay away from the, whatever philosophies you have on that. But I
yeah,
do think that it's just one part of the story, right? And just as you mentioned, Missy, with regards to what we expect teachers to do with students is differentiate teaching and learning. That's what we should do with adults too. So people ingest, are consumers of data, as you mentioned, are consuming data in various ways, not just in one.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so I think that's a nice transition for us is how then can we help? You mentioned earlier that I like the word decoding data, right? Like, how do
Mm.
we help translate or decode data for those non-academic board members who are sitting on their boards going like, what does all of this mean? Like, what does this reading level mean? Or what does it mean if this kid is 2 years behind in reading?
Yeah.
Like, this feels scary. And it's just, how do we start to help them kind of sift through that and understand um, the full picture of where their school
Yeah.
might be and where it needs to go?
Yeah, yeah. This is a challenging part, right? Because I think sometimes data folks are so seeped into their data that coming back out from it, right, and really talking about it from a balcony level or from this, larger oversight level can be sometimes difficult. So this is where the diversification of data, I think, is really important, right? So utilizing different ways to share the data is critical. But also what I've noticed, and this is not a new thing, this has probably been a decade or so of work. But what I've noticed with people who say that they're not data people, I actually think that that's a misnomer. If you live in the state of Texas or the US, you're probably a data person because you probably shop for the best gas prices, right? You probably figure
Mm.
out, like, if I'm going to take a vacation, I'm going to save. And that's all data, right? That's all data. I used to use an analogy of, if you're going to host Thanksgiving dinner, then you're going to have to plan for that, right? And you have to calculate how many people are coming over for Thanksgiving dinner. How does that translate to the poundage of the turkey, or whatever you're going to have? And so that's all data that we're processing. We're our own computer is processing that. So I've definitely got on a soapbox there with
Yeah.
everybody is a data person, but a lot of people say I'm not a data person. And so what I've seen, that even the people say that I'm not a data person, what I've seen are how they've been able to decode data, and how data people, the quote unquote data people, how we can help with that decoding is really putting into terms of 1 in 3, right? One for every 3 children, one of those children is not going to be able to graduate from high school. I think that those are really powerful ratios. So instead of saying, 80% or
Mm.
62.5%, you could say those percentage, but for people who are not the data people, still may not be able to make those connections of what it means for the 3 kids that are standing right here doing the Pledge of Allegiance, right? So I think it's very powerful for the data scientists, the research and development people that are in districts, or the folks who collect the data, to be able to translate that data in very powerful ways of saying 1 in 3. Graphically, the way you show that is, you have all those people, and on a PowerPoint slide, you have like 20 people, and 5 of them are grayed out, or are completely darkened from the others. And that's another way to sort of in a visual way to show that 5 out of these 20 students are going to make it, and those aren't, right? I'm very deficit on the data end right here, but those
Mhm.
are maybe 5 are the only ones that aren't going to make it, and the 20 are going to make it, right? So it just depends on how you want to show the data. Asset based and deficit based is actually an important point, because oftentimes we do, I think, lean on, instead of saying 20 are going to make it as opposed to the 5 that
Mm.
aren't. it does evoke a particular emotion. So if we want movement in a school board to go a certain way, then, I think there's strategy in how you talk about it. So instead of saying 20 are going to make it as opposed to five, then there's a different emotion. If you had used the other way of five aren't going to make it, right, out of these 20, it just provokes a like right brain, left brain, right, starts to really pop in the way you say that data. So I think it involves strategy on how to think about what you want to communicate to your school board. So
Yeah.
the decoding process, I think, is probably the most difficult if you do not have a well-versed data person in your shop who is able to make that translation happen or the decoding happen. But if you're a school board member like myself, and we should all be curious and inquisitive. So if there's something that I don't understand, even today, there's 25 years of working with data and working with community and teachers and administrators. There are things I still might not understand, and so I should be confident in being able to say, I don't understand that. Can you help explain what that means?
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, I monitor at one of our schools, and that has come up. And as I began to poke a little bit more, it turns out that they don't understand that either. Right. So let's go out on a learning journey and figure out what this data is really trying to tell us, and then come back and figure out whether or not our strategies align with what we're trying to do here. But um, I would encourage and advocate for lots of curiosity, lots of questions. Sometimes, unfortunately, when we have our school board meetings, it's the same two people who are asking questions about the data, and the others are snoozing or, focused on what the next agenda item might be. And not to blame anybody about that. We're all human. But I think that puts the onus, right, of the person putting data in front of the school board, and of course the leader or the superintendent really being able to translate for lay people who aren't seeped into the data.
I love that. And you answered my next question is like, what's the responsibility of the board members when it comes to owning this? And I think you're right. It's like they've got to ask the questions and they need to be
Yeah.
engaged. And it really
Yeah.
does if there's any board members listening, like it does such a good service. Because to your point, like sometimes we have the data, but even school folks haven't quite deciphered what that data means or what
Right.
to do with it next or why is it
Right.
happening, right? Like it's like here it
Right.
is. I can tell you the what, I can tell you what the data is. I can't tell you
Yes.
why it is the way it is, and I can't tell you
Yeah.
how we need to use it to make changes moving forward. So I
Right.
think that's great, and just people being engaged in that is so important.
Yeah. Yeah, one
Yeah,
point,
go.
Missy,
Yeah.
on that piece. I think what as school boards, what we probably don't do well enough, and this requires a trusting relationship between the school board, the superintendent, and the staff of the organization itself, right, of the institution, is the vulnerability and the trust between everybody. Because when a piece of data is presented in a school board meeting or in a board workshop or, over an email and a newsletter, and the school board member is confused about the data, are curious about what does this really mean? I see the words in the newsletter, but I'm not so sure what that means.
Yeah.
The idea here, and I think we get scared, like there's some fear associated when a school board member flags something out of curiosity or out of misunderstanding. And so then, like, there's a flurry of activity to respond to that school board member. What we should, and I mean, this is ideal, right? What we should all come to as our responsibility of a school board member, the responsibility of a superintendent, is know that we're coming to a question in trust, right? Not in a gotcha matter or some type of, you're going to be
Mhm.
I'm not trying to penalize you for this, that you got it wrong on the newsletter. I'm trying to come to an understanding. We're coming to the table seeking understanding as opposed to a gotcha. And I think that that's really important relationship development. That's not this podcast, but that's, data can
Yeah.
actually help with that, right? If we can provide the space in a school board meeting, in a school board workshop, in between the time of the school board meetings, and we're relationship developing with school board members, if we could start to build that trust and know that we're coming to a place, a good place of trust and curiosity and really understanding, seeking to understand, then I think what could happen is you could get down to root cause. You can say, what does this really mean? And somebody could respond, well, it means this. Why do we think it means that? Well, we think it means that because of this, right? And you just continue to be able to ask the question, and our strategies and solutions to making the data look better or a more positive could be more targeted to
Yeah.
to the root cause, as opposed to, I think, more often than not, we're still at a surface level. We're really not digging deep on this data. Nobody has the time to do that, and it does involve this
Yeah.
relationship development. You really have to be confident in knowing that nobody's trying to get you for this data, but really trying to figure out, like, are our solutions working around recruitment? Like, we've done all this recruitment stuff, and I'm not seeing it happen. The recruitment is still down, or actually going backwards as opposed to forwards. And how do we get to those solutions that can actually move the data forward? So that's just another piece that I wanted to lift up, because the relationship, we maybe this is just a stereotype and my own projections. I feel like sometimes data can be sterile, and and is and it doesn't evoke emotion unless you have a relationship or you have
Yeah.
some level of trust. Then you could actually dig into the data and have a conversation differently. And so, because of the sterileness of data, a person really has to be personable here and
Yeah.
really ensure that there's that relationship, so that you could understand the data together, you could do something about the data, you can make meaning of it together, and that it doesn't have to be this just complete report out and then you're on your way, right? We have to
Yeah.
sort of figure out how data can have impact in our schools.
Yeah. Yeah. Beautifully said. And also, I've seen it in practice. The school,
Mhm.
when you have a school leader who is able to be honest and transparent about the good and the bad of their data, right? And
Mhm.
then
Mhm.
and the ones who are able to put forth, like, this is not where we want to be. This is
Right.
not good. This is not,
Yes.
this is,
Yes.
we can't stay here. For them to do that, it is very vulnerable because, again, back to your point, right? They're about to present really bad data to the people who are in charge of
Right.
hiring and firing them, right? And
Yes.
it's like, but
Yes.
to be able to go, but I'm trusting you with this bad data because I need a partner right now to figure out how we can move it forward. And I need to leverage your skills and expertise to help us where we're lacking,
Yes.
and help us see too, right? Because, again, I think school leaders, get to your point, right, get so in it, and they need those people who are outside of the walls, outside of, like,
Right.
knowing every kid by name and knowing everything
Yes.
that's going on. It's like, here's an objective lens that I'm able to project onto this data so that we can actually
Yes.
make some steps to
Yeah.
improve it.
Yeah. There was something that you just said that I missed earlier about the responsibility of school boards, and it's partnership, right? So you mentioned it just right now. So I mentioned three pretty tangible or technical things about being a school board member and the responsibility of the school board member. I think one other that is more on the adaptive side is this partnership. Like, how do I be a thought partner to the
Mm.
superintendent, right? Or how can the superintendent be a thought partner to help solve challenges that inevitably come up in any, this is a major organization. It's a mini city that you're running, right? You have utilities, you have water,
Yes.
right? You have, a small bank there, maybe sometimes really large banks, right? So the
Yeah.
the thing is that I did not add it to the conversation earlier when we started with regards to what the responsibility is, but that I would say that that is definitely a responsibility of a school board member, is to be that partner with the superintendent to solve the problems and celebrate
And
and celebrate when it's necessary.
um that's a high note to end on. But before we do end, is there anything else that you want to make sure our listeners hear when it comes to whether it's data or just being a board member, anything else that before we wrap up?
I think some of my final thoughts include basically when you have chosen to be part of a school board or a nonprofit board, and those are the two boards that I know most of. It is a responsibility, right? I think sometimes folks add it to their CV or resume that they've been on different boards. What I've noticed and observed over my years of working with boards, and especially the last 6 or so years with being on boards, is the individuals that are really engaged are the most impactful to both the CEO or superintendent, but also to the work that's happening. All my work, except for the board, the data intermediary board that I'm in, but all the rest of the boards that I'm on have to pertain to families, organizations that work with families and students or children. And so the most engaged board members are having the greatest amount of impact, right? Through, of course, the leader of the organization or the superintendent, and of course to the work itself. So you know, if you're going to be on a board, like, lean in, because and ask the questions, right? You have to really come to a state of seeking understanding, and to build that relationship with the leader of the organization, and lean in, because they need you. They absolutely. I'm a CEO of an organization, and I absolutely need my board. I text them and say, what do you think about this? Or, how's how do we think that students are going to understand this piece, right? So it is a thought partnership, and a partnership altogether.
Love that. Love that. All right. Well, I have one final question for you as we
Yes.
wrap up. It's a question I ask all of my guests. It is in the spirit of my company's name, CheckBox Pro. What is one box, big or small, personal or professional, that you hope to check off today?
Oh, wow. I mean, I have an answer for a different question about a box. Like, what's one box, that we could remove from policy to make life better for people, right? Like answering a question on the census or something. But yeah, yeah. So I mean, that's what I was like, okay, I'm ready for that question. I'm not so sure I'm ready to check off a box today. It might be tomorrow, but on a personal level, we are starting spring break as of like 5 o'clock tomorrow, and so I do hope to check off a bunch of boxes that are on my to-do list for before spring break happens. On a more macro level, um, checking boxes, I think, it could be a metaphor for like what data we collect, and how we collect it, and sometimes that's there's some discrepancies with that, or differences depending on race, gender, and immigration status, and so on and so forth. So, sometimes I wish that those didn't exist, and sometimes the boxes are important because they provide revenue for cities or revenue for school districts, and so there's a lot of boxes that personally I need to check off by tomorrow in order to get to spring break. But maybe another podcast episode, Missy, about what some of the boxes could be to check off on a more macro or meta level.
I mean, you just tell me when.
Okay.
We'll invite you back anytime.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Thank you.
well, awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Munoz. I really appreciate your time. I know you're busy. I'm so excited for you to go into spring break and hopefully,
Yes.
just get a little bit of rest and rejuvenation and some things done. So
Yes.
awesome. All right, listeners. Well, thank you so much. And if you are not serving on a board, but have had that inkling to do it, just find the one that you're already passionate about, so that you can lean in even more strategically, and again push yourself to find that data and move the needle. So we will see you next time.
Great. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all for listening to today's Pro Series conversation. Our team is always looking for more pros to learn from in the field of education. So if you have a recommendation for a future guest, or maybe you are the pro, then send us a note at info@checkboxpro.com. And if you want to hear from more pros, then like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so that you don't miss an episode. And by doing so, this also helps more folks find our show. So take a moment to check that box off your list today.